The Silent Observer. A man walks into one of America's most dangerous prisons, not as an inmate seeking redemption, but as someone who chose to return. Everyone assumed he was just another broken soul accepting whatever work he could find. But what happens when the guards discover that the quiet janitor mopping their floors once commanded their entire world? Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, humility, and second chances. If you're ready to witness a transformation that defies conventional wisdom, stay with this journey, and consider subscribing to discover how ordinary moments can reveal extraordinary character. Marcus Webb pushed his mop across the scarred linoleum of Cell Block D, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The fabric of his gray janitor's uniform hung loose on his 72-year-old frame, and his weathered hands gripped the wooden handle with the kind of steady patience that comes from decades of discipline. Around him, the cacophony of prison life continued its familiar rhythm. Metal doors slamming, voices echoing off concrete walls, the shuffling of feet during the evening count. "Yo, old man," a voice called from cell 47. "You missed a spot." Marcus glanced toward the cell's occupant, a heavily tattooed inmate named Deshawn, and nodded once before redirecting his mop. No words, no irritation. Just quiet compliance that seemed to satisfy the younger man's need to assert dominance over someone, anyone, in this place where power was the only currency that mattered. The correctional officers barely noticed Marcus as he worked. To them, he was simply part of the institutional furniture, another aging contractor brought in to handle the jobs nobody else wanted. They didn't know that 15 years earlier, Marcus Webb had been warden. Marcus Webb, the man who'd transformed Riverside Maximum Security from a powder keg of violence into one of the state's most stable facilities. They didn't know because Marcus never told them. His fall from grace had been swift and absolute. A single decision, protecting a whistleblower who'd exposed corruption among senior prison officials, had cost him everything. The political machinery had ground him down systematically. Forced resignation, pension stripped, reputation destroyed. The same institutions he'd served for 35 years had erased him as efficiently as bleach removes bloodstains from concrete. But Marcus had learned something during those decades managing the most dangerous men in the state. True authority doesn't come from titles or uniforms. It emerges from something deeper, from the quality of one's presence, from consistency of character, from the quiet strength that needs no announcement. As he worked his way down the corridor, Marcus observed everything. He noticed which inmates were forming new alliances, which guards were cutting corners, which tensions were building beneath the surface. His eyes, though surrounded by wrinkles and age spots, missed nothing. They held the accumulated wisdom of thousands of crisis interventions, hundreds of riot preventions, countless moments where the right word at the right time had meant the difference between peace and bloodshed. The other janitors thought him slow, perhaps even simple. The inmates called him Old Man, with varying degrees of contempt or indifference. The guards saw him as invisible. None of them understood that Marcus Webb was exactly where he chose to be, doing exactly what he believed he must do. And soon, everything would change. The test of discipline. When confronted with disrespect and intimidation, most people either fight back aggressively or retreat in fear. But what happens when someone responds with a third option? One that transforms the entire dynamic without a single raised voice. This chapter explores how true power operates in the spaces between reaction and response. If you're discovering value in this journey of transformation, take a moment to engage with this story. Your support helps share these lessons with others who need them. Marcus had been working at Holbrook State Penitentiary for 6 weeks when Dante Rodriguez decided to test him. Rodriguez controlled Pod C through a combination of strategic violence and calculated intimidation. At 34, he'd spent half his life institutionalized and had developed the predator's instinct for identifying weakness in others. The confrontation began during evening cleanup, when Marcus entered the day room to collect trash. Rodriguez sat at a metal table with 3 of his associates, playing dominoes with the focused intensity of men for whom games are never just games. They were negotiations, demonstrations of strategic thinking, displays of control. "Old man," Rodriguez said without looking up. "This area is closed for cleaning tonight." Marcus paused, holding his industrial trash bag. He studied Rodriguez carefully, not with fear, but with the kind of clinical assessment he'd once used when evaluating security threats. He saw the tension in the younger man's shoulders, the way his associates had shifted their positions slightly, creating a semicircle of physical presence designed to intimidate. "I understand," Marcus replied quietly. "I can return later if you prefer." It was the wrong answer, or rather it wasn't the answer Rodriguez wanted. The inmate's jaw tightened. He needed resistance to justify escalation, needed defiance to demonstrate his dominance to those watching. Marcus's calm reasonableness disrupted the entire script. "You don't understand nothing," Rodriguez said, standing now. He moved closer, invading Marcus's personal space with the practiced aggression of a man accustomed to making others flinch. "You're just an old fool who couldn't make it on the outside, so you came crawling in here to scrub toilets." Marcus met his eyes directly, but without challenge. There was something in his gaze that confused Rodriguez. No fear, certainly, but also no anger. Instead, there was a kind of patient attention, as if Marcus were listening to something beneath the words, hearing a message Rodriguez himself didn't fully understand. "You're right," Marcus said simply. "I am old, and I do scrub toilets." The response deflated Rodriguez's momentum. He'd expected argument, denial, or submission, the usual responses that would justify whatever came next. Instead, Marcus had simply acknowledged reality without shame, transforming what should have been an insult into mere observation. "You think you're smart?" Rodriguez pressed, searching for another angle. "You think you're better than us?" "No," Marcus replied. "I think I'm someone who cleans this facility so it remains habitable for everyone here, including you." Something flickered in Rodriguez's expression, a momentary uncertainty. His associates watched, waiting for direction. The moment stretched, pregnant with potential violence, and Marcus understood he stood at a decision point that would establish patterns for everything that followed. He didn't step back. He didn't puff up. He simply maintained his position with the calm certainty of someone who'd faced down riots and hostage situations, who'd talked armed inmates into surrendering, who'd learned that the most powerful response to aggression is often compassionate steadiness. "We'll finish our game," Rodriguez finally said, returning to his table. "You do whatever." Marcus nodded once and began collecting trash from the containers around the room's perimeter. He worked with the same deliberate thoroughness he'd demonstrated since his first day, treating each task as if it mattered, because to him, it did. As he left the day room 30 minutes later, Rodriguez called out, "Old man." Marcus paused. "You got something different about you. Haven't figured it out yet." "Perhaps," Marcus said. "You will." Patterns of observation. The most profound intelligence operates silently, observing patterns others miss entirely. What would you do if you possessed knowledge that could prevent disaster, but revealing that knowledge might cost you everything you're trying to rebuild? This chapter explores the weight of wisdom and the courage required to act on it. Your engagement with these lessons, through comments, shares, or subscriptions, helps spread understanding to those navigating their own challenges. Marcus understood institutional rhythms the way a conductor understands symphonies. During his 3rd month at Holbrook, he began noticing discordant notes in the prison's daily operations, small irregularities that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a troubling pattern. Officer Tyler Brennan had been working the 3 to 11 shift in maximum security for 6 months. He was young, 26, with the earnest dedication of someone who still believed the system could work as designed. Marcus watched as Brennan performed his rounds with textbook precision, checking cells, documenting irregularities, treating inmates with professional distance that avoided both cruelty and false familiarity. But Marcus also noticed how certain inmates tracked Brennan's movements with unusual attention, how conversations would pause when the young officer approached, then resume with calculated casualness after he passed, how Deshawn, the inmate who'd first called him Old Man, had been cultivating a relationship with Brennan, starting with respectful compliance, graduating to brief conversations about football, slowly building rapport. Marcus recognized the pattern because he'd seen it executed successfully twice during his tenure as warden. Inmates were grooming Brennan, establishing trust that would eventually be leveraged for corruption. The young officer probably didn't realize how carefully his psychology was being mapped, his vulnerabilities identified, his potential price points assessed. The ethical dilemma Marcus faced was immediate and complex. If he warned the prison administration, he'd have to explain how he recognized the pattern, revealing his past and inviting questions he wasn't ready to answer. His anonymity protected him, allowed him to work without the weight of his history, permitted him to exist simply as Marcus the janitor, rather than former Warden Webb, whose career had ended in spectacular disgrace, but silence felt like complicity. Brennan reminded Marcus of himself at that age, idealistic, competent, unaware of how sophisticated institutional manipulation could be. If Marcus said nothing and Brennan fell, another promising career would be destroyed, another family affected, another compromise introduced into a system already struggling with integrity. Marcus spent 3 nights wrestling with the decision. During that time, he continued his observations, documenting patterns in his mind with the precision that had once filled incident reports. He noted which inmates were part of the operation, identified the likely objective, smuggling contraband, possibly cell phones or drugs, and estimated they were perhaps 3 weeks from making their approach to Brennan. On the 4th night, Marcus made his decision. He would act, but carefully, preserving his anonymity while still intervening. The method would require patience and precision, 2 qualities he'd spent a lifetime developing. He began by altering his cleaning schedule slightly, ensuring he was present during key moments when the grooming occurred. He positioned himself where Brennan would notice him noticing the interactions. Not obviously, but with the subtle body language of concern. He knew Brennan was observant enough to eventually wonder why the old janitor seemed troubled during certain conversations. Simultaneously, Marcus started leaving small signs of his awareness. He'd clean more thoroughly around cells involved in the operation, his presence serving as a gentle reminder that activities weren't as private as participants assumed. He'd position his mop bucket in ways that slightly disrupted meeting sightlines, forcing conspiratorial conversations to relocate or postpone. These were small interventions, nearly invisible, but Marcus understood that institutional manipulation thrived on the assumption of invisibility. Simply introducing uncertainty, the possibility of observation, could destabilize operations without confrontation. On Friday of that week, Marcus was cleaning near the officer's station when Brennan approached him during a rare quiet moment. "Can I ask you something?" the young officer said. Marcus paused, meeting Brennan's eyes. "Of course. You've been watching cell block interactions pretty carefully. See anything I should know about?" The moment had arrived, the weight of truth. Speaking truth requires courage, but speaking it effectively requires wisdom. How do you warn someone of danger without revealing secrets that could destroy you? This chapter examines the delicate balance between self-protection and moral responsibility. If this exploration of difficult choices resonates with you, please consider supporting this journey by engaging with the content. Every interaction helps these lessons reach others facing their own crossroads. Marcus studied Officer Brennan's face carefully before responding. The young man's question wasn't casual. It carried the weight of genuine concern, perhaps even suspicion that something was developing beyond his awareness. This was exactly the opening Marcus had been cultivating, but now that it had arrived, the stakes felt heavier than anticipated. "May I speak frankly?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their immediate proximity. Brennan nodded, his posture shifting slightly to create more privacy. "Please." "I'm just a janitor," Marcus began, establishing the foundation of his limited authority. "But I've been in institutional settings most of my working life. Hospitals, schools, prisons. Places where people live or work in close proximity under stress." This was true, though it omitted the rather significant detail of his role in those settings. "And?" Brennan prompted. "There are patterns," Marcus continued carefully. "Ways that people build relationships for specific purposes. I've seen inmates become very friendly with newer staff members, not because they necessarily dislike those staff members, but because friendship can become leverage." Brennan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're talking about corruption." "I'm talking about human vulnerability," Marcus corrected gently. "Good people placed in difficult positions can make choices they never imagined making. Usually it starts small. A minor rule bent because someone was respectful or seemed to have a legitimate need. Then the requests escalate incrementally until suddenly a line has been crossed that can't be uncrossed. "Why are you telling me this?" Brennan asked directly. Marcus had anticipated this question and prepared his response with care. "Because you remind me of my son," he said, which was partially true. Brennan shared certain qualities with Marcus's actual son, though that son was now 43 and hadn't spoken to his father in 15 years. "And because I've seen promising young professionals destroyed by situations they didn't recognize until too late." "Are you saying someone's trying to compromise me?" The officer's voice had shifted to something harder, more defensive. "I'm saying," Marcus replied with measured precision, "that if someone were trying to compromise you, the process would look very much like genuine friendship. It would begin with respect, progress to finding common interests, sports perhaps, or shared frustrations with administration. The person approaching you would seem sincere because, in many ways, they would be sincere. Manipulation and authentic human connection aren't mutually exclusive." Brennan was quiet for a long moment, processing. Marcus could see the young man's mind working, likely reviewing recent interactions through this new lens. The silence stretched, and Marcus let it, understanding that insight requires space to develop. "I appreciate the warning," Brennan finally said, "but I have to ask, how does a janitor know so much about institutional corruption patterns?" This was the question Marcus had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. He met Brennan's gaze directly, allowing the younger man to see something of the depth behind his weathered exterior. "I know," Marcus said quietly, "because I've failed to stop it before. I've watched good people fall. I've seen families destroyed. I've attended disciplinary hearings where promising careers ended because someone missed warning signs that seem obvious in retrospect. All of this was absolutely true. I'm old now, and my career opportunities are limited, but I can still recognize patterns, and I can still, occasionally, speak up when silence would be cowardice." The authenticity in Marcus's voice seemed to satisfy something in Brennan. The young officer nodded slowly. "Is there something specific I should be watching for?" he asked. "Watch for the moment when a friendly inmate asks you to do something that seems harmless but breaks a minor rule," Marcus advised. "Watch for when someone tries to create a sense of obligation by doing you small favors. Watch for any attempt to establish communication or relationships outside normal institutional channels. And most importantly, watch your own internal justifications. The moment you start telling yourself, it's just this once, or this is different, that's when you're most vulnerable." Brennan absorbed this thoughtfully. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it." "One more thing," Marcus added. "Don't change your behavior dramatically. If there is an operation developing, sudden suspicion will simply cause it to pause and recalibrate. Continue being professional and fair. Just maintain clear boundaries." As Brennan returned to his duties, Marcus resumed cleaning with the same methodical thoroughness he demonstrated daily, but his mind remained active, analyzing the conversation, assessing potential consequences. He'd taken a risk, revealed more of himself than was perhaps wise, but some risks, Marcus had learned, were necessary. The alternative was watching preventable disasters unfold while possessing knowledge that could have changed outcomes. That was a burden Marcus had carried before. He wouldn't carry it again. Echoes of authority. The past never truly releases its hold. It shapes us in ways that persist regardless of our circumstances. What happens when the identity you've spent months concealing begins emerging through unconscious actions? This chapter explores how authentic self cannot be permanently suppressed, even when exposure threatens everything. If you're finding depth in this journey, please take a moment to subscribe and share. These stories of transformation reach their full power when communities engage with them together. 3 days after his conversation with Officer Brennan, Marcus witnessed an incident that threatened to shatter his carefully maintained anonymity. He was cleaning the administrative corridor, a section of the prison typically quiet during evening hours, when he heard raised voices from the conference room. "I don't care what the protocol says," a voice Marcus recognized as Captain James Reeves was saying, frustration evident in his tone. "We have a credible threat of violence between rival groups, and we're understaffed for the next 6 hours. We need to separate A block and C block populations immediately. We can't just implement emergency lockdown procedures without proper authorization," another voice responded. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, newer to Holbrook but already demonstrating the kind of by-the-book caution that sometimes prevented necessary action. The paperwork alone requires, by the time we complete your paperwork, we'll be documenting an assault or worse. Reeves interrupted. Marcus paused his work. The institutional instincts he'd honed over decades immediately engaged. He understood the dilemma these administrators faced. The gap between established procedure and operational reality. Between covering oneself bureaucratically and preventing actual harm. It was a gap he'd navigated countless times, learning when rules were guidelines for typical situations and when they became obstacles to necessary intervention. He should have continued cleaning, maintained his role as invisible support staff who didn't involve himself in administrative decisions. Instead, Marcus found himself doing something extraordinarily dangerous. He knocked on the conference room door. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Captain Reeves's irritated expression. "Yes?" Reeves asked curtly. "We're in a meeting." "My apologies, sir," Marcus said, maintaining the deferential tone appropriate to his ostensible status. "I was cleaning nearby and couldn't help overhearing. May I offer an observation?" Reeves's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "You're the janitor, right? Marcus?" "Yes, sir." "This is a security matter, I don't think—" "Captain," Marcus interrupted gently. "You're correct that you have a credible threat. You're also correct that formal lockdown procedures are too slow for the immediate situation. But Lieutenant Chen is also correct that unauthorized emergency protocols could create legal and administrative problems." He paused, then continued. "May I suggest a third option?" Something in Marcus's tone, the calm authority, the precise understanding of the institutional dynamics, gave Reeves pause. "I'm listening." "Implement modified movement procedures under the existing maintenance protocol," Marcus said. "Section 7.3 of the operational guidelines allows for temporary population routing changes when facility maintenance requires it. You can separate the populations by routing different blocks through different corridors for the next 6 hours, justifying it as necessary for floor refinishing work in the main corridor." Lieutenant Chen had moved to the doorway now, her expression skeptical. "That's a pretty creative interpretation of maintenance protocols." "It's a protocol designed to give administrators flexibility," Marcus replied. "The substance of what you're doing, separating potentially violent groups, is absolutely within your authority and responsibility. The maintenance justification simply provides the procedural framework that protects everyone involved." Reeves studied Marcus with new intensity. "How does a janitor know Section 7.3 of operational guidelines?" Marcus felt the weight of that question. He'd made a critical error, allowed expertise to surface that contradicted his presumed background. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he calculated his response. "I read," Marcus finally said. "During breaks, I review facility manuals in the staff room, old habit from working at schools. I learned that understanding institutional procedures helped me do my job better, kept me from accidentally disrupting important activities." It was a weak explanation, and Marcus could see skepticism in both administrators' expressions, but it was also just plausible enough that direct challenge would seem unnecessarily aggressive. "That's—" Chen began, then paused. "That's actually a valid approach. It creates a documented justification while achieving the security objective." Reeves continued studying Marcus with an expression that suggested wheels turning behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said slowly. "We'll consider your suggestion." Marcus nodded and returned to his cleaning, but he knew damage had been done. He'd revealed too much, demonstrated knowledge that janitors shouldn't possess. Reeves was sharp enough to recognize the incongruity, and curious enough to potentially investigate further. As Marcus worked his way down the corridor, his hands moved automatically while his mind raced through contingency plans. He'd spent 6 months building this quiet existence, and in one moment of unconscious expertise, he'd potentially compromised everything. But even as he considered the risk, Marcus couldn't bring himself to regret the intervention. The truth was, some aspects of identity ran too deep to fully suppress his decades of leadership. His instinct to solve institutional problems, his inability to witness preventable crises without responding. These weren't merely professional habits. They were fundamental to who Marcus Webb was, regardless of what uniform he wore. Later that evening, the modified movement procedure was implemented successfully, and the potential violence was avoided. Marcus continued his work, knowing that somewhere in the administrative offices, Captain Reeves was likely wondering exactly who the old janitor really was. The question was no longer if his past would be discovered, but when, and what would happen when it was. The price of secrets. Every secret carries a cost, paid in vigilance, isolation, and the constant weight of concealment. But what happens when maintaining that secret begins harming the very people you're trying to help? This chapter confronts the moment when self-protection and moral duty collide irreconcilably. If this journey is challenging you to reconsider your own boundaries between safety and responsibility, engage with this content. Your participation creates community around these essential questions, Marcus noticed, Captain Reeves watching him more frequently in the days following the conference room incident. The observation was subtle, a thoughtful glance when their paths crossed, a moment's pause when Marcus entered areas Reeves occupied. The captain wasn't hostile, merely curious, which was somehow more concerning. Hostility. Marcus could navigate. Curiosity led to investigation. The situation escalated on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was summoned to the warden's office. The request came through Mrs. Patterson, the administrative assistant who'd always treated Marcus with perfunctory politeness. Her expression when delivering the message carried a hint of concern that suggested this wasn't routine. Marcus set aside his cleaning supplies and made his way through the institutional corridors he knew so intimately. As he walked, he mentally prepared for various scenarios. Had Reeves initiated a background investigation? Had someone recognized him from his warden days? Was he about to be terminated without explanation? When he entered the outer office, Mrs. Patterson gestured toward the inner door. "Warden Miller is expecting you. Captain Reeves is also present." Marcus nodded his thanks and knocked, waiting for permission before entering. The office he stepped into was familiar in its configuration. Desk positioned to command the room, chairs for visitors arranged in subtle hierarchy, walls decorated with institutional certificates and photographs. He'd occupied an office much like this one, though in a different facility, in what felt like another lifetime. Warden Jessica Miller was 53, with a reputation for competence and political acuity. She'd been running Holbrook for 4 years, navigating the impossible balance between security, rehabilitation, budgets, and public perception. Captain Reeves stood near the window, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Webb," Warden Miller began, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit." Marcus settled into the offered seat, maintaining the slightly deferential posture consistent with his position while meeting Miller's gaze directly. "Ma'am." "Captain Reeves has shared an interesting story about your intervention in a security matter last week," Miller said, her tone neutral. "He reports that you demonstrated surprising familiarity with operational protocols, including specific policy sections most staff members don't know exist." Marcus waited, understanding that silence was often more effective than premature explanation. "He also notes," Miller continued, "that your approach to the situation suggested administrative experience inconsistent with your employment history." She tapped a file on her desk, which naturally prompted me to review that history more carefully. Marcus felt his pulse elevate slightly but maintained his composed exterior. "I understand. Your application listed previous employment at various institutional facilities in janitorial and maintenance capacities," Miller said. "All the references checked out, all the background checks cleared, nothing in the formal record raised concerns." She paused, then leaned forward slightly. "But Captain Reeves suggested I look beyond the formal record, so I showed your photograph to some of our longer-serving staff members." The moment Marcus had been anticipating for months had arrived. He could see in Miller's expression that she knew, or at least suspected strongly enough that denial would be pointless. "Officer Davidson recognized you," Miller said quietly. "He worked at Riverside Maximum Security 15 years ago, under your command, when you were Warden Marcus Webb." The name, spoken aloud after so many months of careful concealment, felt both liberating and terrifying. Marcus drew a slow breath, then nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, that's correct." Reeves shifted position near the window, his expression now showing complex emotions. Surprise, certainly, but also something like vindication at having his instincts confirmed. "Why?" Miller asked simply. "Why are you working as a janitor in a prison when you once ran one? Why conceal your identity? And more importantly, why return to corrections at all after—" She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging between them. After your very public fall from grace, Marcus considered his response carefully. He owed these people honesty, but he also needed them to understand his motivations without romanticizing or misinterpreting them. "I'm here," he said slowly, "because this is where I belong. Not in administration anymore. That door closed, and rightfully so based on the political realities of my situation, but in corrections, in some capacity, serving the mission I spent 35 years committed to." "You could have gone anywhere," Reeves interjected. "Done anything. Why hide who you are?" "Because who I was isn't who I am," Marcus replied. "The warden who left Riverside was broken, bitter. Feeling betrayed by institutions he'd served faithfully, I needed to rebuild myself without the weight of that identity. I needed to understand whether I could still contribute meaningfully in the humblest capacity, whether my commitment to corrections was about the title and authority or about something deeper." Miller studied him thoughtfully. "And what did you discover?" "That the work itself matters more than the recognition," Marcus said. "That integrity doesn't require an audience, that you can influence an institution from any position if you're willing to pay attention and act with wisdom." "You've been manipulating situations," Reeves said, not quite accusatory but definitely probing. "The Brennan situation, the security protocol. How many other times have you intervened without our knowledge?" 7 times, Marcus answered honestly. "Small interventions, mostly preventive. Nothing that overstepped my position, but yes, interventions informed by experience I officially shouldn't have." The honesty seemed to surprise them both. Warden Miller leaned back in her chair, processing. "I should terminate you for misrepresentation on your employment application." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus agreed. "That would be appropriate." "But I'm not going to," she continued, "because Captain Reeves also reported that every one of your interventions has been sound, professional, and arguably prevented problems. And because, frankly, we need people who care about this institution's mission." She paused, then made a decision Marcus could see forming in her expression. "I'm reassigning you." Transformation of role identity is not fixed. It evolves through choice, circumstance, and the courage to embrace unexpected opportunities. How do you step back into visibility after choosing invisibility? This chapter explores the vulnerable space between who we were and who we're becoming. If you're navigating your own identity transitions, consider engaging with this content and joining others who understand that transformation requires both courage and community. The reassignment Warden Miller proposed was both unexpected and disorienting. Marcus would transition from janitorial services to a newly created position, institutional consultant, with specific responsibilities in staff training, protocol review, and what Miller diplomatically termed cultural observation. It was a role designed to utilize his expertise while acknowledging the political reality that he could never again hold formal administrative authority. "You'll maintain a relatively low profile," Miller explained during that initial meeting. "No direct supervisory responsibilities, no public-facing representation of the facility, but you'll work with department heads to identify systemic issues and mentor newer staff members. Essentially, you'll do formally what you've apparently been doing informally, just with our knowledge and blessing." Marcus had accepted, though with more hesitation than Miller probably expected. The anonymity he'd maintained for 6 months had been protective, yes, but also comfortable. It had allowed him to work without scrutiny, to contribute without expectation, to exist without the weight of his past failures constantly referenced. Stepping back into visibility, even limited visibility, meant accepting vulnerability again. The transition period was awkward. Fellow custodial staff were confused, some feeling betrayed that Marcus had concealed his background. Correctional officers viewed him with suspicion. An ex-warden who'd fallen from grace, now wandering their facility with vague authority inmates, who'd grown accustomed to Old Man and his quiet presence, now saw him in conversation with administrators, and understood he'd never been as powerless as he'd appeared to Sean, the inmate who'd first challenged Marcus months earlier, caught him during movement one afternoon. "You played us," he said, his tone more curious than angry. "The whole time you were watching, evaluating." "I was cleaning," Marcus corrected. Everything else I observed was simply observation. But you knew things, understood things. You weren't just some old man trying to survive. Marcus considered this. I've never been just trying to survive. I've been trying to understand whether I could still be useful, still contribute meaningfully, after losing everything I'd built. The answer, apparently, is yes, though not in the form I once expected. Deshawn studied him carefully. What's it like? Having power, losing it, then finding some other kind? The question demonstrated more insight than Marcus had credited the younger man with possessing. Humbling, Marcus answered honestly. But also clarifying. When you have formal authority, you never quite know whether people respect you or merely respect your position. When that authority is stripped away and you discover you can still influence situations, still help people, still matter, that's when you learn what you're actually worth. Heavy, Deshawn said, then added with unexpected vulnerability. Some of us appreciated it, you know. How you treated everyone with respect, even when we didn't deserve it. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a reminder that the quiet months as a janitor hadn't been wasted. That dignity offered without expectation of return still resonated, still mattered. His formal duties began the following week. Warden Miller had scheduled a series of meetings with department heads to introduce Marcus's new role and establish protocols for his involvement. The reception was mixed. Some administrators, particularly those who'd worked in corrections long enough to know his reputation from his Riverside days, were cautiously optimistic. Others viewed him as Miller's pet project, a politically motivated gesture, rather than a genuinely useful addition. Captain Reeves, surprisingly, became something of an ally. During their first collaborative meeting, Reeves admitted, "I was skeptical when you were just the janitor with opinions. But Miller showed me your record from Riverside, what you accomplished there in terms of reducing violence and improving staff morale. That's exceptional. If even half of that expertise translates here, this facility benefits." "It will translate differently," Marcus cautioned. "I'm not the same person I was, and this isn't the same facility. But yes, I believe I can contribute." The first major test of his new role came 3 weeks into the transition. A pattern of racial tension had been building in C Block, subtle but escalating. Marcus identified it during his observations. The way certain groups self-segregated during recreation, the increasingly charged language during interactions, the positioning that suggested imminent conflict. He presented his analysis to Warden Miller and the security team during a weekly meeting. "We're approximately 5 days from a significant incident," he stated with the certainty born from pattern recognition developed over decades. "The flashpoint will likely be in the shower facilities, where supervision is limited and perceived disrespect can escalate without immediate intervention." Lieutenant Chen, who'd been present during the maintenance protocol incident, asked, "What's your recommended response?" "Increased supervision, obviously, but more importantly, strategic conversation. There are influential inmates on both sides of this tension. Not gang leaders, but respected voices. If we can facilitate dialogue that addresses underlying grievances before violence becomes the solution, we prevent the incident entirely." "Dialogue?" Reeves looked skeptical. "These are convicted felons, not college debate participants." "They're human beings in a pressure cooker environment," Marcus replied calmly. "And in my experience, most prison violence occurs not because people want to be violent, but because they don't see alternative pathways to address legitimate concerns. Give them alternatives that preserve dignity, and many will take them." Miller authorized his approach. Over the next 4 days, Marcus met individually with 6 inmates he'd identified as influential voices. He didn't threaten, didn't impose. He listened. He acknowledged the real frustrations driving the tension, validated concerns where they were legitimate, and proposed structural changes that addressed root causes rather than merely suppressing symptoms. The incident never occurred. On day 6, the tension had noticeably decreased. By day 10, it had dissipated entirely. Captain Reeves found Marcus in the staff break room afterward. "That was impressive," he said simply. "Most administrators would have just increased security presence and waited for the explosion, then dealt with consequences." "Most administrators," Marcus replied, "haven't spent 35 years learning that prevention is always preferable to reaction." His new visibility brought new respect. but also new scrutiny. Marcus understood he was being watched, tested, evaluated constantly. Each recommendation he made, each intervention he suggested, was assessed for effectiveness. He was building a different kind of credibility now. Not the formal authority of rank, but the earned trust of demonstrated wisdom. It was harder in some ways, more vulnerable, but also more authentic. For the first time since his fall from grace, Marcus felt like he was becoming whole again. The student returns. Every teacher eventually encounters the test of whether their lessons have truly been absorbed or merely memorized. What happens when someone you've mentored faces a crisis that will define their character forever? This chapter examines the moment when preparation meets reality, when theory becomes life-or-death decision. If these explorations of mentorship and growth resonate with your own experiences, please share this story with others who might benefit from these insights. Officer Tyler Brennan had taken Marcus's warnings about corruption seriously, perhaps more seriously than Marcus had anticipated. Over the months following their initial conversation, Brennan had demonstrated increasingly sophisticated awareness of institutional dynamics, identifying and diffusing several situations where inmates were attempting to compromise staff members. He'd become, in many ways, exactly the kind of officer Marcus had hoped to develop: principled, observant, capable of both firmness and empathy, which made what happened on the evening of March 14th so profoundly difficult. Marcus was in the training office reviewing updated protocols with two newer correctional officers when the emergency alert sounded. Lockdown. Facility-wide. Code 4. Hostage situation. The details came quickly through radio traffic. An inmate had somehow acquired a weapon during recreation and taken a hostage in the maximum security unit. The hostage was Officer Tyler Brennan. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. This was every corrections professional's nightmare, the scenario that turned abstract policy into desperate reality, where lives hung on decisions made in fractions of seconds, where years of training either prepared you adequately or failed catastrophically. Warden Miller's voice crackled through the facility. PA system. Facility lockdown in effect. All inmates return to assigned cells immediately. All staff report to designated emergency stations. Response team to staging area Alpha. Marcus should have reported to his designated emergency station, the administrative wing where non-security personnel were supposed to shelter during crisis situations. Instead, he moved quickly toward maximum security, his decades of crisis experience overriding formal protocol. If Brennan was going to survive this, he would need more than the standard hostage negotiation playbook. He reached the outer perimeter of the crisis zone as the tactical response team was gearing up. Captain Reeves saw him approaching and raised a hand to stop him. "Marcus, you can't be here. This is an active crisis situation." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "Who's the hostage taker?" Reeves hesitated, then answered. Dante Rodriguez. He's barricaded in the shower facility with Brennan. Claims he has a sharpened piece of metal against Brennan's throat. Demands transfer to a different facility and guarantee of no additional charges." Marcus's mind raced Rodriguez, the inmate who'd tested him during his second week as a janitor, who'd said Marcus had something different about him. The same inmate Marcus had later learned was the ringleader of the group attempting to compromise Officer Brennan months earlier. "Let me talk to him," Marcus said. "Absolutely not," Reeves replied immediately. "We have trained negotiators." "Who Rodriguez doesn't know and won't trust," Marcus interrupted. "He knows me, not as an administrator, but as someone who treated him with respect when he had no power to demand it. That relationship might matter now." Warden Miller arrived at that moment, her expression tight with stress. "Status?" Reeves briefed her quickly, then added, "Marcus wants to negotiate. I've told him that's not protocol." Miller looked at Marcus, her eyes sharp. "This isn't your job anymore. You're a consultant, not a crisis negotiator." "I was a warden for 35 years, Marcus replied. "I've talked down 14 hostage situations. I know Rodriguez, and more importantly, he knows me as someone without an agenda beyond basic human decency. If there's any chance of resolving this without violence, it's through relationship rather than procedure." Miller processed this for perhaps 5 seconds, an eternity when measured against the risk to Officer Brennan's life. "You have 15 minutes, she decided. "If no progress, we go tactical." Marcus nodded and moved toward the shower facility, accompanied by two members of the tactical team who positioned themselves out of sight, but within intervention range. As he approached, he could hear Rodriguez's voice, elevated and strained. "I'm serious. Anyone comes in here, I cut him. I've got nothing to lose." "Rodriguez," Marcus called out, his voice deliberately calm. "It's Marcus, the janitor. Can we talk?" A pause, then, "Old man, what are you doing here?" "My job," Marcus replied, which apparently now includes trying to help resolve situations before they become tragedies. "Can I come closer?" "You alone?" "Just me. No weapons. Just an old man who wants to make sure everyone walks away from this alive." Another pause, then, "Approach slow. Hands where I can see them." Marcus moved forward carefully, maintaining maximum visibility of his empty hands. As he entered the shower facility's outer area, he could see Rodriguez backed against the far wall, one arm around Brennan's throat, the other holding what appeared to be a sharpened bracket, crude but effective as a weapon. Brennan's face was pale but composed, his training evident in how still he remained despite obvious fear. "I'm here," Marcus said quietly. "Let's talk about what you need." Rodriguez's expression was a complex mixture of desperation, anger, and something like shame. "I need out of this hellhole. I need guarantee they won't add more time for this. I need—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I need people to stop treating me like I'm nothing." And there it was, beneath the hostage-taking, beneath the violence, the fundamental wound that drove so many prison crises. Not just the immediate circumstances, but the accumulated weight of being dehumanized, disregarded, reduced to a number and a security classification. "I understand," Marcus said, and meant it. "You don't understand nothing," Rodriguez spat, but without real conviction. "I understand," Marcus continued, "what it feels like when the system you're in treats you as disposable, when everything you've done or been gets reduced to your worst moment, when people stop seeing you as a person with legitimate needs and start seeing you only as a problem to be managed." Something flickered in Rodriguez's expression. "How would you know?" "Because 15 years ago, I was a warden, a good one. And then I made a decision that powerful people disagreed with, and everything I'd built over 35 years disappeared in weeks. My reputation, my pension, my career, gone. And for years afterward, I felt exactly what I think you're feeling now. Invisible, discounted, trapped in a situation with no dignity and no viable path forward." Rodriguez stared at him. "You were a warden?" "I was. Now I clean toilets. Or did. I've been reassigned recently. But that transition, from respected authority to someone people ignore or dismiss, I've lived it. So when I say I understand, I'm not offering empty sympathy. I'm sharing actual experience." "Then you know," Rodriguez said, his voice cracking slightly, "what it's like when nobody listens unless you make them listen." "I do," Marcus acknowledged. "And I also know that the attention you get through violence is different from the respect you get through integrity. One lasts only as long as the crisis. The other builds over time and actually changes how you're treated." Marcus took a careful step closer. "Officer Brennan here. He's listened to you, hasn't he? Treated you fairly?" Rodriguez's grip on Brennan tightened reflexively, but Marcus could see uncertainty in his eyes. "He's okay. Better than most." "Then harming him doesn't actually address what you need," Marcus said gently. "It might feel like power in this moment, but it will guarantee exactly the outcome you're trying to escape. More time, worse conditions, permanent categorization as violent and dangerous." "So what?" Rodriguez demanded. "I just give up? Go back to my cell and nothing changes?" "No," Marcus said. "You make a different choice. You release Officer Brennan unharmed, demonstrating self-control and regard for someone who's treated you decently, then you work with me. And I promise you this will happen. To address the legitimate grievances that drove you to this point. Not through violence, but through the kind of persistent, principled advocacy that actually creates lasting change." The facility's emergency response continued around them, but in this moment, the entire crisis centered on one question. Would Rodriguez trust Marcus enough to choose a harder but ultimately more constructive path? Marcus waited, letting Rodriguez process, giving him space to make a decision that preserved dignity while avoiding disaster. After what felt like hours, but was perhaps 90 seconds, Rodriguez's arm around Brennan's throat loosened slightly. "You promise? You'll actually listen? Try to change things?" "I promise," Marcus said. "Not that I can fix everything. I can't. But that I'll advocate honestly for addressing legitimate concerns. That you'll have someone in this institution who sees you as a person, not just a problem." Rodriguez looked at Brennan, then back at Marcus. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he released his hold on the officer and lowered the makeshift weapon. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." The ripple effect. One act of courage creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment, touching lives in ways we cannot predict or measure. What happens when choosing principle over self-interest inspires others to do the same? This chapter explores how authentic leadership operates, not through commands or authority, but through example that awakens possibility in others. If you're discovering how these themes of influence and integrity apply to your own life, please engage with this content and help build a community around these essential principles. The aftermath of the Rodriguez incident transformed Marcus's position at Holbrook in ways he hadn't anticipated. The hostage situation had been resolved without violence, without injury, through what the official report termed unconventional crisis negotiation. But beyond the paperwork and formal debriefings, something more fundamental had shifted in the institutional culture. Officer Brennan, once released and cleared by medical staff, sought Marcus out the following day. They met in a quiet corner of the staff break room, and for a long moment, the younger man simply looked at Marcus with an expression too complex to easily categorize. "Thank you," Brennan finally said. "Not just for talking Rodriguez down, but for—" He paused, searching for words. "For teaching me that the warning you gave months ago wasn't about paranoia or cynicism. It was about understanding human complexity. Rodriguez was trying to compromise me, yes. But he was also a person dealing with legitimate frustrations in the only ways he'd learned." "Both things can be true simultaneously," Marcus replied. "That's the challenge of corrections, holding space for accountability while maintaining empathy. Most people want to choose one or the other. The real work requires embracing both." "How do you do that?" Brennan asked. "How do you maintain that balance when everything in this environment pushes toward choosing sides, either seeing inmates as purely victims or purely threats?" Marcus considered this carefully. "You stay grounded in your own principles. You decide what kind of officer, what kind of person you want to be, and you make decisions consistent with that identity, regardless of external pressure. You'll make mistakes. You'll face situations where the right choice isn't clear. But if you're consistently trying to act with integrity and compassion, most of those mistakes can be corrected." Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Reeves, who'd been looking for Marcus. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Warden Miller wants to discuss something." In Miller's office, Marcus found not just the warden but also the facility's chief psychologist, Dr. Ellen Morrison, and the head of inmate services, Rafael Santos. The group's composition suggested this wasn't a routine meeting. "We've been discussing the Rodriguez situation," Miller began. "And more broadly, the approach you took to resolving it. Dr. Morrison has some thoughts." The psychologist leaned forward slightly. "What you did yesterday, building relationship with Rodriguez months ago without agenda, maintaining respect even when he had no power to demand it, then leveraging that relationship during crisis, that's sophisticated trauma-informed practice. Where did you learn that approach?" "Decades of trial and error," Marcus answered honestly. "Early in my career, I relied heavily on authority and control. It worked, but it created constant tension and limited my effectiveness. Over time, I learned that most behavior, even violent behavior, makes sense when you understand the context driving it. If you can address context, you often prevent behavior." "We'd like you to develop training," Santos interjected. "Not just for security staff, but for everyone who interacts with the inmate population. Something that teaches what you demonstrated yesterday, how to see people as complex rather than simply categorizing them as compliant or threatening." Marcus felt the weight of what they were requesting. Training meant codifying principles he'd developed intuitively, translating lived experience into teachable methodology. It meant greater visibility, more responsibility, deeper investment in the institution's success or failure. "I'm willing," he said slowly, "but with conditions. The training can't be superficial or performative. It requires honest engagement with how our own biases and fears shape our interactions. That makes people uncomfortable. Some staff will resist." "Let them resist," Miller said firmly. "After yesterday, I have authorization from the State Corrections Commissioner to implement whatever changes I think will improve facility safety and culture. Your approach is now our approach. We make this happen." Over the following weeks, Marcus developed what became known informally as Web Protocol, though he tried unsuccessfully to prevent his name being attached to it. The training combined practical communication techniques with deeper exploration of trauma, power dynamics, and the psychology of institutional environments. The response was mixed. Younger officers, particularly those like Brennan, who were still forming their professional identities, embraced the approach enthusiastically. Veteran staff members were more skeptical, viewing it as soft or naive, though several admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that elements resonated with their own experiences. The most surprising response came from the inmate population. Word spread about Marcus's background, about how he'd gone from warden to janitor to consultant, about his role in resolving the Rodriguez crisis. Inmates began requesting to speak with him about various concerns, not just complaints, but genuine attempts to problem-solve around institutional challenges. Deshawn, the inmate who'd first called him Old Man, became something of an informal liaison. He explained it during one of their conversations. "Most administrators talk at us, not with us. You actually listen. Even when you can't give us what we want, you explain why in ways that make sense. That's rare here." "It shouldn't be rare," Marcus replied. "Respect isn't something people have to earn through perfect compliance. It's the baseline of how human beings should treat each other." "Yeah, well, tell that to corrections," Deshawn said with familiar cynicism. Then, more thoughtfully, "Actually, I guess that's what you're trying to do." 3 months after the Rodriguez incident, Warden Miller called another meeting. This time, it was just Marcus and her, late on a Friday afternoon when most administrative staff had left for the weekend. "I need to tell you something," Miller said. "The Commissioner's office has been following the developments here. The reduction in violent incidents since implementing your protocols, 37% decrease in 3 months, has caught attention. Other facilities are interested in similar training." Marcus felt equal parts pride and apprehension. "That's positive." "They want you to develop a statewide training program," Miller continued. "It would mean traveling to different facilities, working with varied populations and staff cultures, essentially becoming the voice for this approach across the corrections system." "That's a significant expansion of role," Marcus said carefully. "It is. And I'll be honest, part of me doesn't want to lose you here. You've become integral to how this facility operates. But the larger mission matters more than Holbrook's specific interests. If your approach can improve safety and culture throughout the system, that's bigger than any single facility." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. For 15 years, he'd been retreating. From public failure, from responsibility, from visibility. He'd convinced himself that small, local contribution was sufficient, that he'd lost the right to larger influence. But perhaps that was fear masquerading as humility. Perhaps rebuilding meant eventually accepting that the hard-won wisdom from his fall could serve purposes beyond his personal redemption. "I'll do it," he said. "Not because I'm seeking recognition or trying to reclaim what I lost, but because the lessons I've learned about power, humility, persistence, compassion, those lessons cost too much to keep to myself. If they can help prevent even a fraction of the suffering I've witnessed in corrections, I have an obligation to share them." Miller smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. We'll start developing the framework next month." As Marcus left her office and walked through the facility toward the exit, he noticed how different the environment felt from when he'd first arrived as a janitor 2 years earlier. The tension level had decreased palpably. Staff members moved with more confidence and less defensiveness. Even the inmate population seemed more settled, less reactive. Not perfect, certainly, Holbrook remained a prison, with all the inherent challenges that entailed. But better. Measurably, meaningfully better. And Marcus understood, perhaps for the first time since his fall, that his greatest contribution might not be what he'd accomplished as a warden with full authority, but what he'd learned through losing that authority and having to rebuild from nothing. Sometimes the most powerful teaching comes from having been broken and finding ways to make even the brokenness meaningful. The wisdom of the journey. Every journey of transformation ultimately leads to a moment of integration, when past and present merge, when hard-won lessons crystallize into living wisdom. What defines us isn't the heights we reach or the depths we fall to, but who we become through the entire journey. This final chapter explores how authentic transformation operates across time, through failure and recovery, through humility and renewed purpose. If this story has touched something in your own journey, please share it with others who might need these insights, and consider subscribing to continue exploring these themes together. 2 years after becoming a statewide corrections consultant, Marcus Webb stood before a graduating class of correctional officers at the State Training Academy. At 76, he remained sharp and vital, though he moved with the deliberate care of someone aware of their body's accumulated years. His hair had gone fully white, and the lines in his face had deepened, but his eyes maintained the alert quality that had characterized him throughout his career. The class represented the third cohort he'd trained under the new protocols, young men and women, diverse in background and experience, unified in their decision to enter one of society's most challenging professions. Marcus understood that some would thrive, some would struggle, and some would ultimately leave the field. But if his training gave them tools to approach the work with both strength and humanity, he would consider his effort worthwhile. "Thank you for your attention these past 2 weeks," Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority developed over decades. "Before we conclude, I want to share something personal. Not because my story is exceptional, but because it illustrates principles we've been exploring throughout this training." He paused, letting the room settle into attentive silence. 50 years ago, I entered corrections as a young officer, not much different from you. I was idealistic, energetic, certain I understood how things should work. Over the next 35 years, I built a career, developed expertise, eventually became a warden. I won awards, received recognition, believed I'd achieved something lasting and important. Marcus moved slowly across the front of the room, making eye contact with various students. Then I made a decision, a principled decision, protecting someone who'd exposed corruption that powerful people disagreed with. Within months, everything I'd built was gone. Career destroyed, reputation shattered, identity erased. I became invisible, dismissed, occasionally pitied. For years, I was bitter, felt betrayed, struggled to understand how doing what I believed was right could result in such comprehensive punishment. Several students shifted uncomfortably, uncertain where this narrative was heading. Eventually, Marcus continued, I decided to return to corrections in the only capacity available to me, as a janitor. Not because I enjoyed the irony of cleaning facilities I'd once commanded, but because corrections was the mission I still believed in, and I needed to discover whether that belief was genuine or merely attached to status and recognition. He paused again, his expression thoughtful. Working as a janitor in a maximum security prison taught me more about effective corrections than any of my years as an administrator. It taught me that real influence doesn't require formal authority, that respect emerges from consistency and character rather than position and power, that you can impact an entire institutional culture through how you treat people when you have absolutely no leverage to demand their cooperation. Marcus returned to the center of the room. The protocols you've been learning, trauma-informed practice, de-escalation techniques, relationship-based management, these didn't come from textbooks or academic theory. They emerged from having to rebuild credibility and effectiveness without any of the traditional tools administrators rely on. From learning that authority imposed through fear or hierarchy is fragile and temporary, while authority earned through demonstrated integrity and consistent compassion is robust and lasting. He looked across the class, his expression serious, but not severe. You're entering a profession that will challenge every assumption you hold about human nature, justice, redemption, and your own capacity for both compassion and controlled force. You'll encounter people who've committed terrible acts. You'll witness suffering, waste, dysfunction. You'll be tempted, repeatedly, to protect yourself emotionally by categorizing inmates as simply other, as less than fully human, as deserving of whatever happens to them. Marcus's voice dropped slightly, becoming more intimate despite the room's size. I'm asking you to resist that temptation, not because inmates deserve it, though many do, but because you deserve it. Because becoming the kind of person who can maintain their humanity while working in dehumanizing environments is the real achievement of this profession. Because at the end of your career, what will matter isn't how tough you were or how strictly you enforced rules, but whether you maintained integrity and compassion even when both were difficult. He smiled slightly, the expression carrying warmth. Some of you will think I'm naive. That's fine. I thought similar things about officers who expressed these views when I was your age. Experience will teach you what I cannot, but I hope you'll remember these principles when you face your own moments of crisis, your own opportunities to choose between what's easy and what's right, your own temptations to abandon complexity in favor of simple categorization. Marcus concluded his remarks and opened the floor for questions. A young woman in the third row raised her hand. Sir, after everything that happened to you, losing your career, having to start over, do you have regrets? Would you make different choices if you could? Marcus considered this carefully. I regret the pain my choices caused my family. My son and I are still rebuilding our relationship, and those years of estrangement were devastating. But the decision itself, protecting the whistleblower who exposed corruption, I wouldn't change that. Some things matter more than personal cost. And honestly, the person I became through losing everything is someone I respect more than the person I was at the height of my success. Failure taught me lessons that success never could. Another hand went up, a young man near the back. How do you maintain compassion when you're dealing with people who've hurt others? Doesn't empathy for offenders dishonor their victims? That's an important question, Marcus replied. And I'd say this. Empathy and accountability aren't opposing values. They're complementary. You can acknowledge that someone's harmful behavior emerged from trauma or limited options while still holding them fully responsible for that behavior. You can recognize humanity in someone while also recognizing the legitimacy of their punishment. The alternative, treating inmates as purely evil or beyond redemption, doesn't actually serve victims or society. It just makes our corrections system less effective and our institutions more dangerous. The questions continued for another 40 minutes, covering everything from specific de-escalation techniques to broader questions about corrections philosophy. Throughout, Marcus responded with the patient thoroughness that had become his trademark, treating each question as genuinely important, regardless of how basic or complex. As the session concluded, several students approached Marcus individually. One, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been particularly engaged throughout the training, said, "Thank you for being honest about your experiences. A lot of instructors present themselves as having everything figured out. Hearing about your struggles and mistakes makes the lessons feel more achievable somehow." That's the point, Marcus replied. Growth doesn't happen through pretending we're perfect. It happens through acknowledging our failures and extracting wisdom from them. Every mistake I've shared with you cost me something, sometimes a great deal. If those costs can prevent even some of you from making similar mistakes, then they weren't purely destructive. They became instructive. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with Warden Miller, who'd driven to the academy for the graduation ceremony. Over coffee in the academy cafeteria, they discussed the program's ongoing evolution and upcoming training schedules. "You've built something remarkable," Miller observed. "When you first arrived at Holbrook as a janitor, I never imagined we'd end up here, with you training the next generation of corrections professionals, with your protocols being adopted statewide, with measurable improvements in facility safety and culture." "I didn't imagine it either," Marcus admitted. "Honestly, I was just trying to survive, to find meaning in whatever capacity remained available to me. The larger impact emerged organically from that smaller intention." "That's usually how it works," Miller said. "We don't plan transformation. We just make consistent choices aligned with our values, and eventually those choices accumulate into something significant." She paused, then added, "I heard from Commissioner Wallace yesterday. They're considering establishing a permanent position, Director of Trauma-Informed Corrections Practice. Essentially, formalizing what you've been doing informally. It would come with appropriate salary, benefits, recognition. Would you be interested? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. The position Miller described represented full professional rehabilitation, recognition that his expertise had value, that his contributions mattered, that his past failure didn't disqualify him from meaningful work. It was, in many ways, the vindication he'd stopped expecting years earlier. "I'm honored," he finally said. "And yes, I'm interested. But I need you to understand something. I don't need the title. The work itself is what matters to me. If administrative recognition helps the mission, I'll accept it. If it becomes about ego or status seeking, I'll walk away. I've learned too much about what actually matters to compromise that understanding for professional advancement." Miller smiled. "That's exactly the attitude that makes you the right person for this role. Someone who doesn't need the position is often the person who can do it most effectively." As evening approached, Marcus drove back toward his small apartment, a modest space that remained deliberately simple despite his improved financial circumstances. He'd learned during his years of loss that material comfort, while pleasant, wasn't essential to well-being. What mattered was purpose, integrity, the sense of contributing meaningfully to something beyond personal interest. His phone rang as he pulled into the parking lot. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in months, but recognized immediately. His son, Michael. "Hello?" Marcus answered, heart rate elevating slightly. "Dad," Michael said. "I was thinking about our last conversation, about what you've been doing, the training programs, everything. And I wanted to say, I'm proud of you. Not just for rebuilding your career, but for how you've done it. For letting failure transform you rather than just destroying you." Marcus felt emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you, Michael. That means more than I can adequately express." "I know Mom would be proud too," Michael continued, referencing Marcus's late wife, who'd passed away 10 years earlier. "She always said your greatest strength was your refusal to become bitter, even when bitterness was justified." Looks like she was right. They talked for nearly an hour, bridging gaps and healing wounds that had persisted for too long. When they finally ended the call, Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, processing. This, he thought, was what redemption actually looked like. Not the dramatic public vindication he'd once imagined. Not the formal apology from those who'd destroyed his career. Not even the professional recognition that now seemed forthcoming. Instead, it was a quiet phone call from his son, a relationship slowly rebuilding, a family beginning to heal. It was reduced violence in facilities he'd helped transform. It was young officers learning to lead with integrity. It was inmates like Rodriguez and Deshawn discovering that even in prison, dignity remained possible. It was the accumulated weight of small, consistent choices made over years, choices to maintain principles when abandoning them would have been easier. Choices to help even when helping brought no obvious benefit. Choices to believe that people and systems could change even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Marcus finally exited his car and walked toward his apartment. Inside, he found the space exactly as he'd left it. Simple, orderly, containing what he needed without excess. On his desk sat the materials for next month's training session, alongside a draft of an article he was writing about trauma-informed practice for a corrections journal. He'd spent the day teaching, the evening reconnecting with his son, and now he'd spend a few hours preparing for future work. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life he'd once imagined during his years as a warden. But it was meaningful, authentic, aligned with values he'd fought hard to preserve and develop. Marcus sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began writing. Outside, the sun set over the city, casting long shadows that gradually faded into darkness. But inside, in the small circle of light from his desk lamp, Marcus Webb worked steadily, contributing what he could, building what remained possible, living fully in the identity he'd spent years discovering beneath the ruins of his former self. He was no longer the warden he'd been. He was also no longer the broken man who'd arrived at Holbrook as a janitor, hiding from his past and uncertain of his future. He was something new. Something forged through failure and recovery, humility and persistence, loss and unexpected restoration. He was simply Marcus. And finally, after all these years, that was enough. Thank you for joining this journey of transformation and resilience. If this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might benefit from these lessons about perseverance, integrity, and finding purpose in unexpected places. Consider subscribing to discover more narratives exploring the complex paths of human growth and redemption. Your engagement helps these stories reach people navigating their own challenges, reminding them that identity can be rebuilt, that failure can teach profound wisdom, and that true strength often emerges from our most vulnerable moments. Every chapter of life, even the most difficult, can become meaningful when we choose to extract wisdom from our experiences and share that wisdom generously with others.